Amicus is essentially instituted this application to advance arguments that are going to ensure that the minister and or the chief inspector, or even for that matter, the mines themselves, exercise any statutory powers that they have in a manner that protects mining affected communities during the COVID-19 pandemic, irrespective of the statutory provisions that are going to be invoked under these circumstances. Furthermore, as a stakeholder in the mining industry, I'm going to address this a bit later, Amicus also feels that they ought to be consulted insofar as decisions relating to any regulatory framework that is adopted. And in this regard, I want to then move to addressing the socio-economic circumstances. But first, I just want to highlight, Judge, that as things currently stand, the only party in these proceedings who has made reference to the mining affected communities is in fact the applicant. The other parties, that being the fourth respondent and the state respondents, have not addressed any issues insofar as they relate to the well-being of mining affected communities, especially when one considers the vulnerability that they find themselves under. So those are going to be the submissions. Now, coming back to the socio-economic circumstances, these have been highlighted both in the application and also in the heads of argument. What one wants to highlight in particular is that mining affected communities are in fact characterized by inadequate access to services, poor infrastructure, high levels of poverty, and unemployment. And notwithstanding the regulatory framework that seeks to ensure that there is some form of socioeconomic welfare of mining affected communities in the country, there continues to be a disjunction in so far as the intention of this particular framework and when one looks at how it is implemented. The argument is that in many instances, these provisions are in fact not being implemented at all. And the experience of Amicus suggests that mining affected communities are often left in a worse off position as a result of mining and its consequences. And in many instances, it's also led to a loss of important resources, such as water, that, of course, considering the fact that mining is a water-intensive industry. And this is particularly important under circumstances where the public has generally been advised and encouraged by government to regularly wash their hands. The difficulty with these communities is that there is very low accessibility to clean, portable water in which they can do these things. Now, there are also specific circumstances that make these communities particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And some of these circumstances relate to environmental and health issues. So whilst the environmental well-being lies at the core of environmental rights in terms of Section 24 of the Constitution, what one finds as experience, according to amicus, is that there is a high prevalence of respiratory illnesses within mining affected communities. Here you're talking of illnesses such as tuberculosis and silicosis. Now, these pre-existing conditions make the mining affected communities particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And of course, it doesn't end there. There is also an issue that relates to food security. And according to amicus, the experience is that there is a scarcity of land in which these communities can engage in any form of subsistence agrarian activity to support themselves, and insofar as it is possible, to also produce for sale within their communities. And this issue is particularly important because it arises under circumstances where the weakening of immune systems also raises the likelihood of mortality when one contracts the virus.
Mr. Siyo, I'm sorry to interrupt. Look, I'm sure you've outlined in great detail in your bits of argument many and more of these considerations, and they're important considerations, don't get me wrong. But in these proceedings, it seems to me we're now at a point where what's really at issue is whether or not the court is going to review a failure to make a decision in relation to Section 9 and make, in the exercise of a discretion in relation to remedy, substitute, as I understand, AMCU submissions, which are along the basis that there will be consultation with affected parties and stakeholders, which no doubt would extend, as Section 9 contemplates, to persons who are directly affected by activities that are mined. And we're at a point where there's going to be a discussion shortly between the legal representatives as to the nature of any interim relief that's to be granted. What I need to understand from you is precisely what it is that your client submits ought to be part of that package.
Well, part of that package, although, Judge, you make reference to, for instance, Section 9, the experience is simply that the mining affected communities are not engaged and involved at all in these type of consultations. And you'll have reference to the argument that we make in our heads to the effect that the consultations that are sought by our clients are of a different nature, particularly when it comes to the question of simply issues being put on the government gazette and for comment. There's a great difficulty with that, because that will not allow sufficient and meaningful engagement. Okay, that won't allow meaningful engagement with the communities, especially considering the vulnerability. So what the amicus would seek under those circumstances is there to be included in that order that the parties that are deemed as stakeholders for purposes of such consultations should include mining affected communities, and that there ought to be meaningful engagement with those communities insofar as any measures that are going to be taken. Because according to amicus, absence of any form of consultation with mining affected communities would essentially render any regulatory rules that are put in place unreasonable and irrational. And the thinking behind that is simply this: if you don't engage persons who are likely going to be affected by the decisions that you make, then they are unreasonable, and irrational. Because many of the mine workers actually live in these communities. And we highlight in the heads that there is an intrinsically linked relationship between the mine workers, and the mining affected community. And any regulations that only consider the miners outside of the context of the mining affected communities will then leave the mining affected communities susceptible and vulnerable to the contraction of COVID-19. And given the socioeconomic circumstances that I've highlighted to you, then that causes a high level of likelihood that there would be some form of deaths that occur. And it is this type of I beg your pardon, of a consolidated or unified approach to this issue that the amicus seeks to ensure is taken upon. And that's the entry point that the amicus has in this matter. The amicus says that we understand that there are competing views insofar as which regulatory framework that ought to be used. The point that we make is that irrespective of the regulatory framework that is going to be used, mining affected communities must be included in that, in order for there to be further meaningful engagement, in order for there to be comprehensive rules that are put in place insofar as the protection also of mining affected communities. And in this regard, the amicus accepts that the Mining Health and Safety Act, in fact, also places certain horizontal responsibilities on the mines themselves to ensure that, as your Lordship has already referred to ensure that mining affected communities are protected during this period. And it is specifically that that is trying to be enforced. The experience seems to be that, Judge, that they are left out and they are generally ignored when it comes to these types of circumstances. Of course, it's not the first time that the amicus has approached courts in order to advance the rights of their constituents. You'll see that there's reference to a matter that related to consultation, once again, relating to the mining charter in which the amicus participated to. So it's a long-standing issue that amicus has identified to be a problem within the mining industry, and that this court is well placed to rectify or to provide any clarity that ought to be given under these circumstances, especially considering the seriousness and the urgency with which the issues that are before the court have. And those
yes, thank you. And I mean, you're of course aware of